Wherever you are in the world, welcome to another edition of Jerry's Take on China from Hainan Island, where I am, as you can see, in full holiday mode. In this edition, I'd like to thank my friend Dan in Hong Kong for the question. Dan is the co-founder with his wife Jo of Make Meaningful Work, which you can find at the very easy to remember website of makemeaningfulwork.com. Dan's question to me was quite thought-provoking. He asked, why can't the USA and its government accept China on equal terms? My answer, based on my opinion, is in 4 parts. Capitalism. As far as the USA is concerned, capitalism is the best method of advancing any society. Unbridled capitalism is even more preferred, as it means the government has little or no control over the regulations of any business or industry. Now, we've seen how that worked in the banking industry. We've also seen how it worked in the housing industry in China, where regulations weren't strong enough. But we're currently watching as health costs in the USA spiral out of control of individuals and even to the point of failure for insurance industries. Their only way to survive is to pass costs back onto the patients, because nothing is controlling the cost of increases there. 2 major consequences of this are 40% of US bankruptcies are due to medical expenses. That's a true statistic. The life expectancy of the average American citizen has reduced by several years, while at the same time China's has grown. But that will never be acknowledged by Western media. It must be denied, or it will prove the failure of capitalism. But what's even worse than the failure of capitalism is it will prove the success of China. Every capitalist banker will tell us that communism won't work. But try to imagine a communist country that's been allowed to work by those capitalists. Whenever it looks like being successful, there's a coup. Whenever they have failed, it's because of sanctions, or worse. Vietnam chose communism and had a long war as a result of it, as did North Korea. China chose communism and had 20 years of sanctions or embargoes before they were offered reform and were allowed to rejoin the international community. There were 2 main reasons for this. One was that it provided a pool of very cheap labor, impoverished by those very US sanctions. And the other reason was it drove a wedge and it prevented the growth of Russia, or the USSR, another communist country that was not allowed to survive. If, or I should say when, a communist country is allowed to thrive and prosper, it will be proof, especially to the millions of people living in poverty under capitalism, that the wrong system has proven to be the right one. USA will be angry with Vietnam right now. Vietnam has agreed to increase their diplomatic relations with the USA. But what we won't see in Western media is that they didn't agree to reduce China's status. Only Reuters, of all the media that I saw, reported this accurately. Every other media outlet just reported an increase of status to the highest level for the USA, rather than describe what it actually was. Vietnam wishes to do business with both economic superpowers. Therefore, they elevated the USA to the same status that China has enjoyed for many years. Another thing we're unlikely to see in Western media is that just days after Joe Biden left Vietnam, the president of Vietnam was back in China for his 2nd visit of the year and praising China's cooperation with ASEAN. The 3rd and 4th reasons why US can't accept China on an equal footing are rooted in racism and religion. White people have effectively ruled the civilized, as they would call it, world since the era of the Romans. Rome took the Mediterranean from Egypt and therefore had access to all the African slaves, which remained the way of the world for the next 2,000 years. While other civilizations in the East did exist, you can read Peter Frankopan's New Silk Roads for a much better and far more detailed description of this than I could ever provide. Those nations were traded with, they were warred with from time to time, but they weren't taken advantage of until the 1500s, when Portuguese traders reached Macau and Formosa. Then came the Dutch, the Brits, the French, the Italian, the Japanese, and of course, the Americans. So, after 500 years of looking down on Chinese people from a lofty imperial perspective, the very thought of a person from that nation of that color being capable of bettering the US is hardly able to enter into the US psyche. It was marginally okay for Obama, who critics see as half white, and many critics see as a Muslim too, but it's not okay for Chinese, who have, since they were first discovered by those Dutch and Portuguese traders in the 16th century, been considered inferior. Our books, our kids' comics, our movies, our media, they've all been telling us for centuries that this is so. And it's impossible for many Americans to accept that Hollywood, their literature and their media could have been so wrong for so many years. But they are. The final one is religion. And for the same reasons, the Middle East were allowed to keep their oil. They were only allowed to do so if Western powers could control the flow. Locals were individually allowed to become rich, but not allowed to become regional powers. Constant Western-provoked and supported wars between Middle Eastern countries have weakened them economically at the same time as further enriching the oil powers. Currently, those are the USA, and prior to that, notably Great Britain and Holland with BP and Shell. Now, this wasn't just because they were the wrong color, but because they also believed in the wrong God. The Middle East has been under the sword of Christianity since 1096, when the First Crusade began. The same is still true for China, because they are considered by the US under the principle of manifest destiny to be godless and therefore expendable. China, like the Middle East, was allowed to keep its profit from the cheap manufacturing that was offered to it by the largesse of the USA's capitalist system. But what was not expected was what the godless heathens here would do with it. They used it to improve humanity for hundreds of millions of people. And while doing so, they invested most of their profits back into the country so that the same hundreds of millions of people would get further benefits from the infrastructure, the health facilities, education and transportation, communications, every other benefit that capitalism did not expect them to provide. It must have been a great shock for those capitalists to find that China was not the same as them. They would probably have assumed a few small members of the leadership elite would become as rich as them and would then help them to further exploit the rest of the nation and the world. What they've actually found is that the period of over 400 years of exploitation is now coming to an end, and the exploited are seeing it for what it really is. This month saw 65 nations attend the 6th China Arab States Expo in Yinchuan, Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region. That's a Chinese Muslim autonomous region in northern China. Central European, African, Middle Eastern, and South American countries are joining trade pacts with China. Arab countries are putting aside their differences and working together. 46 other countries just attended the China ASEAN Expo in Nanning, and they included the Philippines and Vietnam, China's nearest neighbors. In fact, it's all going horribly wrong for the capitalists. What's likely to happen is that the group of countries that call themselves the international community are going to end up in some kind of trading bloc that will attempt to isolate China, but they no longer have the economic clout to do it. Looking at the G7 economies, we see Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK in either negative growth, recession, or less than 1% growth. They have all, however, decided to spend more on defense. And Italy has made the first, I think, outrageous move. Despite a declining GDP, it has taken itself out of the Belt and Road Initiative. I can only think that this was likely to be an instruction after the last G7 meeting. Get out of BRI or you're out of the G7. We're seeing a change in the way the world has been run, but the leaders of the past 400 years are yet to recognize what appears to be absolutely certain. The time has come when they must either share with China in order to stay relevant, or spurn China and become irrelevant. Unfortunately, spurning China seems to be their preferred opinion. I hope this answers Dan's question, and thanks once again for watching Jerry's Take on China, and I'll see you the next time. Bye for now.